Think of it this way. The anti-Chinese alliance in the Pacific, which the United States is part of, includes Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines to some extent, Indonesia, Singapore, where the U.S. has bases, and also Australia. China has not a single ally with which it can operate militarily in the Pacific or really anywhere. The only country it's formally allied with is Pakistan. And the reason is most countries don't see much value in an alignment with China. Also, China has scared most countries. People who believe what China says want to be allied with others, and people who don't believe that, what they're claiming, tend to be hostile to them. So it's one of the key elements that is ignored about China, its isolation in the world.
You touched on it slightly there, George, but why does China not have closer, better, friendlier relationships with other countries?
Well, it begins with economics. China is in a desperate position economically. It is the world's largest exporter. It is facing the world's largest importer, its biggest customer, the United States, with hostile relations. Therefore, it tries to find other countries in the region to export to. Many of those countries are competing with China economically. So there's an entire dimension that we forget about China. It survives by exports. Its biggest customer doesn't want to buy from it, or not as much as it used to. Other countries feel the pressure from China. It's not necessarily good. The second reason is China is now taking to threatening. So, for example, if it's threatening an invasion of Taiwan, I think that would fail miserably. And moreover, you don't announce the country you plan to invade. But the other countries hear it. The Japanese hear it. The Filipinos hear it. Everybody in the region hears it, and they're thinking, after Taiwan, what? So China has, for domestic reasons, I think, painted itself as a extremely powerful power that is about to lash out, frightening everybody. And secondly, as a titan of international trade, which the Japanese, for example, doesn't want to hear. So China has convinced its population, and many outside, that it is an extraordinarily powerful country, but in fact it has many Achilles heels. One of them being the fact that if you're the largest exporter, you live and die by your customers.
So the US-China relationship certainly gets a lot of attention. It is possibly the most significant international relationship on the planet right now. How do you see it?
It begins again with economics. China systematically prevented American products from reaching the Chinese market. It had to. It was trying to build a domestic demand and domestic production, and the U.S. would be able to overwhelm it. The United States is a much larger economy than China's. The Americans came back with what almost any country would, saying, look, we want some access to China in exchange for you having access to the United States. The Chinese balked. They had to. As a result, the Americans basically said, well, if you're not going to allow us access, we're not going to allow you access, or we're going to carve it back somewhat and put sanctions and tariffs on China. The Chinese reasonably panicked. They had to have access to the largest market in the world. And the Americans refused to bend. I mean, they had no reason to bend. So the problem that the Chinese have is they must have good relations with foreign countries. They can't afford to really let those foreign countries have reciprocal relations with China, except on terms China defines. And it lost, or is losing, its largest customer. Now, I've been in business a little bit, and I have heard that don't irritate your biggest customer. Just don't do that, because he's going to stop buying. And that's what the Chinese did. And the Chinese are playing out that hand now, and the Americans are basically just holding their position and watching it happen.
The idea that there could be potentially a Cold War between the US and China is frequently discussed. I mean, to be fair, so was the idea of a second US-Russia Cold War. During the Cold War, the original one, the trade that went on between the Soviet Union and the United States was nothing like what we see today between the US and China. Do the economic ties between those two countries simply mean that a Cold War, in the sense of the previous one, is just not going to happen?
Well, there's more trade than we were thinking of at the time. There was tremendous trade in grains. Russia had to import them. Tremendous trade in oil, which Russia had and Europe needed to have. It wasn't emphasized, but it was going on because it had to go on. I think the issue here is that China can threaten war, but it's going to have difficulty waging one. For one thing, China has never fought a naval war, at least since 1895 when it was defeated by the Japanese. It has a lot of hardware, but the humanware, the trained admirals who have drawn on an institutional memory of warfare, aren't there. It is opening this by claiming that it is going to have an amphibious operation against Taiwan. Nothing is harder than an amphibious operation for two reasons. Firstly, getting the men to the right place is very tough, as we learned in Operation Overlord and other things in the Pacific. Secondly, you have to keep resupplying them. And the ships that are coming to resupply these men are highly vulnerable to air attacks. So the reason we are not going to have a war is, one, the United States has no desire to have a war with the Chinese. Nor isn't it planning to allow the Chinese to dominate the Western Pacific. And the Chinese really don't have a geographical and strategic position where they can carry out an attack. And the biggest problem the Chinese have is they may lose. Whenever you start a war, as the Americans have learned in Vietnam and Iraq and other places, don't assume that you're going to win. And in the case of the United States, well, we endured the defeats. China has built itself internally as a heroic power. If it were to invade or try to invade Taiwan and lost, the regime would, I think, face serious challenge at home as to how that could have happened. So it's much better to threaten than to do. And therefore, I don't think either side is going to attack. The U.S. has nothing to gain from attacking China. We can't go anywhere. We can't go on shore. There's millions of them. And the Chinese have too much at risk to carry out that war. And in a sense, that's the same thing as why the Cold War ended the way it did. Each side was afraid of war. The Russians were terrified that it would lose a war. The Americans and the Russians were both frightened of nuclear weapons. The Americans had no reason to attack. They were just waiting. That's the game the Americans usually play. And in the end, what was the point? That was the interesting thing, that it ended in a whimper. The Russians went away. So I think it is like the Cold War. And like the Cold War, it never turned into a hot one, and probably couldn't because everybody's afraid of one.
Is our constant desire to see this as a new Cold War somewhat short-sighted? I mean, does it ignore the longer history of the world where, relationships between two powers that don't agree on everything, can be different to just a Cold War in the sense of what happened between the US and the Soviet Union?
Well, I mean, there's a confrontation. And when you're having a confrontation, it's at least one side is going to try to bluff. Because if the bluff becomes credible, and the Soviets bluffed and the Americans bluffed, the other side might back off. So the Chinese, without any allies, facing the possibility of dealing with the largest and most powerful navy in the world, and a very experienced one, is bluffing hostile actions. The United States is bluffing blockading Chinese ports, because we're there in the South China Sea. We could close them off. We could close off the Straits of Malacca. Okay. Well, we have no intention of doing that. That would start a war. And the Chinese don't have anything. So what we're having here is not a reference back to the Cold War. It's the simple interplay between nation states that have serious issues with each other none of which warrant combat, where each side tries to bluff the other into backing off. The difference is the Chinese are isolated and therefore have only a bluff. The United States is sitting there with an alliance structure that is really larger than NATO was, sitting back and not responding. Of course, the media will get all excited about this. They'll think that the Chinese have said they're going to invade Taiwan. Well, one of the guarantees is that if you're planning to invade a place, you don't name it months ahead, because the other side can build up. And so we know that's not going to happen. China's problem is naval. The Russians do not have significant help they could provide the Chinese in confronting the West. The Russian confrontation in Ukraine or further west is ground warfare. The Russians don't need that kind of help. What the Russians need is tremendous investment out of China. That they would like. They still couldn't help the Chinese. What the Chinese would like was the Russians buying more of their goods. Well, the Russians can only buy so much. So when you look at an alliance, when you look at the Cold War and you saw the American alliance with, say, Britain beforehand, the two militaries were intertwined. The economy of Britain was dependent on the economy of the United States. The land of the United States was dependent on the invasion of Europe. This was an alliance in which each side had something to offer, in fact, were indispensable to the other. In the case of Russia and China, it's a concept, but when you take a look at how they would bear the burden of each other, the Chinese are going to be coping with the Americans and the Japanese and everyone else by themselves. The Russians can't come. So it would be another thing, to declare themselves allies. That's nice. Now, what are you going to do about it? Well, that becomes much more difficult. So alliance is a piece of paper, a working alliance. Look at the U.S. and Britain in World War II, or the U.S. and Australia. So the problem here is there's one thing they could do: simultaneously attack the United States. Russia by attacking Europe and NATO, China by attacking the fleet. That would be an interesting cooperation. The problem is the Russians are not that strong, and they're highly dependent on their relationship with Europe. They don't want to destroy Europe, God knows. And the Chinese, without that, are on their own, as they are now. So the really important thing when we talk about international relations are the details. You use various terms, relationships, alliances, many things. But when you ask the question, what exactly does that mean? What are you going to do for each other? Well, that's an issue. And this is the problem with China today. It puts itself as an adversarial relationship with the United States. It still has access to U.S. markets. That hasn't been cut off, just some prices change. Were the U.S. to cut off their access to the United States, this would be a devastating blow. They don't want that to happen. We don't want that to happen. So we have this kabuki play, kind of like a New Zealand haka, and we're threatening each other, but we don't mean it. We don't expect a war with China. The Chinese don't expect a war with us. Not with small countries, but the great powers have far more to lose than they could gain in a war. And the risks to each of them are way too high. The U.S. is not going to attack China or Russia. Russia is not going to attack Europe, and the Chinese are not going to engage the U.S. fleet and everybody else in order to get more sales.